also ask the organization team to start it. All right, it just started the live broadcasting on YouTube, because we are also watched by groups across Russia, apart from the core group that works with us today. And I'm going to switch to Russian.
Could you send me the streaming link so I could post that on social media now?
I will ask the team in a moment.
Okay, very good.
Друзья, добро пожаловать всем, кто присоединился. И я рад приветствовать нашего завершающего в этой серии очень интересных лекций этой недели спикера, который будет выступать из Калифорнии, Гил Френд. Наверное, одна из самых важных каких-то характеристик Гила — обладает невероятным опытом в области темы устойчивого развития, глубоко понимает эту тему и в практическом смысле, не только как мыслитель, но и как человек, который внедрял эти решения в первую очередь в управлении регионом, в корпоративном управлении. Гил, в частности, работал и на уровне городского управления в Пало-Альто, которое, как вы знаете, является самым сердцем Кремниевой долины. Также в офисе губернатора Калифорнии. То есть в этом смысле Гил практической работой внедрял все те решения, которые мы сейчас ищем для того, чтобы предотвратить экологический кризис и найти другие формы организации экономики. Но кроме этого, Гил еще мыслитель, который ищет, собственно говоря, пути в будущее, и его называют одним из 10 наиболее влиятельных голосов темы устойчивого развития в США. Так что мне кажется, что это уже достаточное представление, чтобы стартовать наш разговор. И для нас, я сейчас скажу последнюю вещь. Гил, спасибо большое, что вы с нами, потому что Россия, наконец, осознает всю важность климатической повестки и темы устойчивого развития в 20-е годы. И это является одним из приоритетов. И в частности, та группа, которая собралась здесь и будет встречаться на следующей неделе, будет разрабатывать целый ряд предложений по расширению вот этой повестки и внедрению новых идей в эту повестку с точки зрения системы управления. Поэтому ваша лекция очень важна, и мы приветствуем вас у нас.
Pavel, thank you so much. It's great to see you again, and I'm delighted and honored to be here with you at Archipelago 2121 to share my thoughts and hopefully contribute in a small way to your very important work. And bear with me while I manage all my technologies here. So the journey for me to where we are now, all of us together on this tiny planet, swimming in space, not just a tiny planet, but if you think about it, I learned from my mentor. Oh God, pardon me, we have trouble with slides. Yes, and let me put on the other microphone if we could.
Мы решим небольшие технологические проблемы. Гилу надо поменять микрофон и также запустить презентацию.
This one. Audio is good now? Okay, very good. So almost 50 years ago, just after I finished my undergraduate studies, I spent the summer with this gentleman, Buckminster Fuller, who many of you may know, the inventor of the geodesic dome, but more importantly—
We don't see your slides, by the way, if you have any.
Yeah, thank you, Pavel. Let me try it again.
Yes, now it works.
Very good, thank you. So Buckminster Fuller, not only the inventor of the geodesic dome, but the inventor of something called world game. He proposed back in the 1960s that instead of playing war games to figure out how we can kill each other faster and more effectively, we could play a world game to have teams compete to see who could better get us to a world that works for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. That was the challenge he posed. And as a 23-year-old kid fresh out of college, I spent a month with a team from around the world looking at that problem challenge, not as a philosophical challenge, but as a very practical one. We broke up into teams looking at energy, water, food, housing, transportation, education, recreation, and a number of other areas. And in each group, the challenge was to describe very specifically where we are today as a planet. What does the status say of food and hunger around the world? And which, as you know, is better than it used to be, but still 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night on this planet. We then described the preferred state. What would be the ideal? What would be the future that we would want to live in, where everybody was housed and clothed and fed and comfortable? And what would it take specifically to do that? And then in what for me was the most brilliant breakthrough, instead of trying to figure out the path from today into the imagined future, we stood in the imagined future as though it had already happened. And then we looked back into the past and asked the question, how did we do that? And this, in fact, this is the technique that the American National Aeronautic and Space Administration, NASA, did for the Apollo moon landing mission back in the 1960s. The President Kennedy declared on international media that we will land a man on the moon and bring him back alive within 10 years. This was 1962. And our NASA space organization didn't have the mission built, planned, executed, technology built, and so forth. One of the first things they did was that exercise of reverse engineering the future, looking 10 years out and saying, what did we do in the 9th year in order to enable the 10th year to be successful? What did we do in the 8th year to enable the 9th year, and reverse engineered the mission that ultimately, as you know, was successful. So that's a technique that stood with me from that time, partly because of its brilliance and partly because every single area that we looked at, energy, food, agriculture, transportation, housing, and so forth, it was clear, diving deep into the data, that there was no necessary barrier to human success on this planet. The problem was not the lack of resources. The problem was not lack of technology and emerging technology. The challenge is in the human will, in what we decide we want to do and what commitments we make to do that. And so at that point, as a 23-year-old kid, I signed on to that mission, and that's what's guided my life since then. Since then, I've worked with some of the world's best companies, Hewlett-Packard to Levi Strauss, from Steelcase to SunPower, identifying for them not just ways to operate more sustainably, but to deliver billions of dollars of new economic value by doing that. When I began this work with corporations in the 1990s, the standard listening that I would hear from executives was, well, this is all very nice. Of course, we'd like to be ecological, but we can't afford it. It costs too much money. It will take away from our profits. And the message that we've been carrying for 30 years is, thank you, but actually that's not correct. Actually, if you reduce your waste, become more efficient, align with the principles of the living systems of this planet, which, think about it, have 3.8 billion years of experience in developing and operating systems that are efficient and productive and adaptive and resilient. 3.8 billion years of open source research and development available free to all of us that we can learn from. And in fact, the lessons on the ground is that companies become more profitable, become more resilient, have better relationships with their customers and their employees, innovate more effectively and more profoundly. And that's the lessons that come from looking at Earth's ecosystems, a system that runs on solar energy, that generates no waste. The waste of one organism is the food of the next. It has relatively flat organizational structures, hierarchy very limited, and it's circular. Everything goes around. This is a little model of the system of the biosphere, which, if you think about it, is a thin layer wrapped around an 8,000-mile diameter. I'll let you translate that into kilometers. Ball of rock that's hurtling through space at 18,000 miles an hour. And Bucky Fuller used to teach that if you took a ball about the size of a basketball, made of stainless steel, polished stainless steel, the surface of that polished steel ball is rougher than the surface of our planet, from the highest mountains to the lowest ocean troughs. If you breathe on that ball, to fog it with your breath, that fog is thicker than the biosphere that sustains everything that we value. So it's a delicate balance, and yet it works. And there's something we can learn from that. We learn from that design principles of how to have a world that is stable, that doesn't inhibit nature's ability to run the photosynthetic cycle that produces all wealth, that doesn't accumulate materials from the Earth's crust or synthetic materials into Earth's living systems, and that removes the barriers that keep people from living full and sustainable lives. This is from the Natural Step framework from your neighbors in Sweden, which is, I have found, one of the most powerful and effective sustainable development management frameworks that we've seen. So, so I've learned from both the work with Fuller and my work as a systems ecologist and my work with these companies that there are pathways for us, that there are strategies, design principles, operating examples that support us in what is really our fundamental task here today, which is to reinvent the economy of the planet, this planet, and to do that in one generation. That's behind everything that we all share and that we're all doing. The good news about that is that there are miracles all around us. This is the an electron microscope photo of the footpads of a gecko lizard. These are the little lizards that will walk up walls and walk on ceilings. And there's no adhesive involved. There's no glue, there's no hooks, there's no Velcro, there's electron forces, van der Waals forces in the electrons at the tips of the pads that enable this enormous sticking power to turn on and off as needed. This is an example brought forward by Janine Benyus, the founder of the biomimicry movement, that says, let's look to nature for the design principles that can let us deliver breakthrough technologies that meet the needs that we have now. But, despite this enormous progress, we're in a heap of trouble. We're in extraordinarily difficult circumstances as a planet. There's the looming trauma of the climate emergency. And we see examples of that all around us this very week. All of a sudden, people are waking up to say maybe something really is going on here. In Portland, to the north of us, this week, they set historic temperature records 3 days in a row. Monday was the hottest they'd ever seen. Tuesday was the hottest they'd ever seen. Wednesday was the hottest they've ever seen. 250 people dead in British Columbia and Canada from the heat of the last few days. I'll go on to say what we're doing positive about this, but we are moving far too slowly to deal with this crisis. We face the prospect of a pandemic era, not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but the pandemics to come. And we've seen in some ways very powerful, unified global response about that, and in some ways real disappointments at our level of coordination and the speed at which we've been able to move. We're facing the reconfiguration of the post-World War II geopolitical order. It's different, it's changing. We don't know where it's going to go in the relative balances between leading powers. In the United States, we're seeing a shredded social fabric, in part because of the effect of our last president, but really things that have been brewing for us longer than that. The tenacious cancer of racism around the world, the rising struggle around the world in many countries between democracy and authoritarianism. and the structural defects, I will say, of capitalism to engage and operate in a living world in a way that works. So I say that we are living between worlds, that we are, sorry, I'm being challenged on my technology here, that, that we are living between worlds, that we are between old worlds and new. We're in the transition from the fossil age to the renewable energy age, from a linear take, make, and waste economy to a circular economy. Between making small adjustments at the edges of our policies and practices to really reinventing everything that we do. And this is a time of great uncertainty. Futurists used to talk about predicting the future. I think people increasingly recognize that we can't predict the future. In this transition that the caterpillar goes into toward what it may become, in that chrysalis on the right-hand side of your screen, if you open that up, you would find jelly. You'd find nothing that looks like a caterpillar and nothing that looks like a butterfly. And that's where we are now, in this in-between place. In that chrysalis, there are things called imaginal cells, which hold the template of what is to become. And I would suggest that we here are the imaginal cells for the future of this planet, one we can't predict, but one that we can anticipate and hopefully help shape. And we do that at the level, at every level, from international organizations to countries, to cities, to companies, to our own households and the daily practices that we live with. So, what are the transitions that we're talking about? A slide challenge, my friends. So the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations lay that out in a good and basic way. More than 190 countries have signed on to this. What's notable to me about these goals that try to span the concerns of humanity, that unfortunately read like a product of a committee, so it's not poetry. But it's notable that number one doesn't say reduce poverty, it says no poverty. Global commitment, 190 some odd countries. Number two doesn't say reduce hunger, it says no hunger. And the question that we would ask of our clients who struggle with this, I'd say, well, how much hunger is acceptable to you? How many children dying every day is acceptable to you? The only morally acceptable answer is 0. The practical question is separate. How do we get there? That's a practical question, but the goal has to be unmistakably clear to everyone. This is moving forward in political dimensions, like this, like the Paris Climate Agreement, like the national level commitments to the countries that are committing to 0 carbon emissions by 2050 or 2040 or 2030. The bans on internal combustion engines that we're seeing in, what is it now? I think about 15 countries. The cities, more than 1,000 cities around the world that have declared a climate emergency. These are cities containing more than 1 billion people, more than, almost 1/8 of the planet's population has said, we see a climate emergency and we're going to move on that. Companies from Volvo to General Motors, at the scale of cities, my city of Berkeley 2 years ago became the first city in the world to ban new hookups of natural gas to new buildings. And that's been followed by dozens of other cities in California and more around the world. So we have that political dimension that is driving. All of that driven back at the personal and household level by all of us around the world demanding things of our governments, demanding things of the companies that we buy things from or decide not to buy things from. And, and it's both, it's strange, it's both moving very fast and moving too slowly, but it gets faster all the time. Last year, Amazon, the corporation, finally announced their carbon goals. They said they would be carbon neutral by 2040. That very week, Microsoft announced their goals actually IKEA was next and said they're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. The few days later, Microsoft said we're not only going to be carbon neutral by 2030, we're going to have sequestered all the carbon we've ever produced in our history as a company. So you see this ratcheting up of the goals. What was good enough is no longer good enough. When I was chief sustainability officer for the city of Palo Alto, I helped drive what was at that time, 2016, the most aggressive climate action plan of any city in the United States. This is kind of what Palo Alto does. It's a city that likes to innovate. If you look at that plan today, it's boring. It's not very exciting. It's not leading anymore. It's good, but it's not at the cutting edge because the cutting edge has escalated every year as new innovators step forward with new programs. Let's look at this specifically in terms of the energy transition. So it used to be that renewable energy was a luxury and was too expensive. This is the curve, both actual and projected, for the development of renewable energy in the California market. You can see the dramatic reduction in the cost of solar photovoltaic electricity. In the wind energy, you can't see the difference as clearly. You can see the cost of batteries plummeting by several orders of magnitude in a matter of years. The capital cost for a 100% solar, wind, and battery system in California has fallen by 85% in the last 10 years. We expect it to fall by another 75% in the next 10 years. So the possibilities that break open from that are enormous. The cost of building solar electricity plants is less than the cost of operating coal-fired power plants. So the economic fundamentals become very clear. It's not a matter of belief or ideology or faith or regulation. In fact, we've always told our clients not to pay attention to the regulation, pay attention to the fundamentals of reality. These economic drivers are why solar is exploding around the world. Let's see, do we have that? No, I don't have that other slide there. And so the adoption rates are phenomenal. In this last year, solar has eclipsed coal in terms of contribution to energy production on the planet. Here in the case of automobiles, on the right, you see the cost of internal combustion engine vehicles. On the left in blue, the cost of electric vehicles. There is no question that electric vehicles will replace gasoline-powered vehicles. How quickly? We can argue about that. The direction, unmistakable. Change moves very quickly. These are technology adoption curves in the United States. They'd be similar in shape around the world. On the left, you can see technologies taking decades to become dominant in the marketplace. On the right, 1980, 2000, 2016, as far as this one goes, you can see technologies moving into market dominance in 10 or 5 or even 3 years. So this throws the whole game of predicting the future into a trash bin. Because when these things change this rapidly, what do you do? How do you think? How do you orient? How do you navigate? Where do you stand? And I would argue that you stand on those fundamental principles of how Earth's living systems operate. Renewable energy, zero waste, circular flows of materials, no accumulated toxic materials, flat hierarchies, and the ultimate test is that if something fails, it's gone. We don't, nature doesn't sustain things with subsidies. If it doesn't pass the test of survival, it's gone. So there's our lesson. Just as I'm not going to go into this, but just a flag for you, there's something called the SIBA Technology Framework. Tony SIBA, with a company called Rethink X, has laid out in a very disciplined and systematic way how these kinds of disruptions happen, how you can see them, and how you can drive them. And I would encourage you to have a look at that work. And the activities that are going to help make this happen are really can fall into 3 categories: reducing the use of destructive resources and materials, shifting from old technologies to new technologies that do that better, and transformation of systems. So an example of reducing is energy efficiency to run a building with less energy use. An example of a shift would be to shift from natural gas, which generates greenhouse gases, to renewable electricity, which doesn't. An example of a transformation, and for there we could talk about shifting from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles. An example of a transformation would be shifting from car ownership to what our friends in Finland call mobility as a service. I own an automobile. It's a hybrid, which is better than it might have been, but I own an automobile and it sits in my driveway about 96% of the time. And I use it about 4% of the time. So what I've just done there is I've committed massive assets in steel and rubber and manufacturing capacities for a capital item, my vehicle, that's barely used. Makes much more sense to get a vehicle when I need it, rented by the minute or by the hour from Lyft and Uber and the various companies like that. So changing of systems to embed sustainability into our practices, to align the financial incentives that we provide in taxes and subsidies to where we really want to go as a planet. And there are numerous examples of this that we could go into. But what it takes is setting that commitment, like President Kennedy did in the 1960s, that we will land on the moon and return safely. What did we need to do in the imagined successful future to get there? And to see this emergence from the imaginal cells in the jelly, in the chrysalis, to developing something that is, in this case, resplendently beautiful. Not just pragmatic, not just something that pollinates flowers, but something that lifts our hearts. So what is asked of you in this process? What's ahead for Russia? You have some unique situations. You have an economy that is significantly dependent on fossil fuels. The global economy for fossil fuels is going away. Maybe not in my lifetime, but certainly in some of your lifetimes. The markets for what you produce and what generates a significant chunk of your foreign exchange is going to be gone. What will you do? How will you transition, not just how you operate in your own country, but how you operate in a global economy? You're in a cold climate. Hot in Moscow today. The climate will change for you as for others, but the differences are going to play out differently for you than for others. Closing off some opportunities and opening up some others, perhaps out of sync with the global consensus, and that raises interesting challenges geopolitically. You're a country that's highly educated, with brilliant capability. Tremendous technological capability. Your country facing enormous shifts in your population trends. The structure of your society demographically and the demographic layers is changing in very significant ways that pose real challenges for you. So what do you do? And again, the questions that I've been posing to my clients and colleagues lately, I give credit to this from my mentors, Fernando Flores and B.S. Rouse, who this is adapted from a book that they're writing, are three questions. How will we learn to belong to a living planet? Not just to live on it, but to belong to it as living beings. The French philosopher Bruno Latour, in his book Down to Earth, says, we're living together in the critical zone, that thin tissue of life on the surface of this ball of rock that we live on. And in that are creatures. Let's call them Earthians, because they live on Earth. Well, we are Earthians, the same as the monarch butterfly, and the same as the earthworm, as the same as the tiger, the same as the eagle. How do we live belonging to, and the tundra and the forests and the jungles and the oceans? How do we live as living creatures that belong to that? If we didn't pretend that we're something different, if we lived as if we're part of that, what would we do? How would we live? What kind of systems would we develop to support that? Second question, how will we govern our communities? And I say communities because it's at every scale, from international to national, from cities to households to companies. How will we govern? How will we collaborate? How will we coordinate activities with ourselves? There's a lot of interest in the sustainability movement in decentralized activity, locally based solutions, shorter supply chains, adapted to place. That's all very good, but a lot of what we do needs to depend on international coordination. How do we do that? How will we do that? And third, and this is a question that's not looking for an answer, but it's looking for us to step into the question and orient to the question, what will be the system of the world? The Bretton Woods Agreement is going away. US dominance of the world economy may be going away. The rise of China is unmistakable. The future of Russia, not so clear, but clearly significant. The future of the EU, the relationships are shifting. One very simple example, I talked about foreign exchange before. In Australia, thousands of miles away from China, nearly 50% of their exports go to China. One of their most significant sources of foreign exchange is tuition from Chinese students studying in Australia. Australia, which is ostensibly in the Atlantic Alliance with the United States and England and the EU, is developing a very different relationship with China, the rising power in that part of the world. Big changes. What do those mean for us? What's good? What's bad? What can we adapt to? What can we take advantage of? How do we think into these things? These three questions that don't have crisp answers, but that put us into a different space of inquiry and discovery and learning. How will we learn to belong to a living planet? How will we govern and coordinate in our communities? What will be the system of the world? So, clearly I don't know your circumstances in detail. I don't know your challenges and constraints and opportunities in detail. So the question I ask you is, what will you do? How will you think? How will you learn? How will you coordinate? How will you act boldly and powerfully in the face of the constraints that you're living with? And this is in everything from, people often think about political activity when they think about global strategies, but I also think about the purpose of your organizations. What's the purpose of your company if you run a company? We argue here with executives who say, well, the purpose of our company is to make as much money as possible and give as much return to our shareholders as possible. And I would say, no, that's not the purpose. That's the result of your purpose. You don't go into work every day and say, the purpose today of my company is to pay the light bills to the electrical company. That's just something you have to do. The purpose of your company is what the company is there to do. And this is not just, some guy in San Francisco talking about this. There was a guy in San Francisco called A.P. Giannini. He was the founder of the Bank of America more than 125 years ago, one of the great financial institutions in the United States. And he said to his investors, he said, the purpose of this bank is not to maximize return to shareholders. The purpose of this bank is to provide credit to immigrant communities in San Francisco who do not have access to credit. If we do that successfully, he said, we will make a lot of money. And that was true, but he was driven by the purpose, not by the profit. This is a big shift that we face. Not everybody runs companies, but everybody buys things from companies. So you have decisions that you're making every day in what you buy, what you prefer, what you refuse to buy. This is the elections that happen every day, not just every 2 years or 4 years or 8 years, but we vote every day with every dollar and every ruble and every Deutschmark and every Renminbi. And this, in fact, has been one of the things that has driven the corporate and political shift, is people voting with their money for organic food rather than chemically produced food, for renewable energy rather than fossil energy, for energy efficient buildings or energy producing buildings rather than the traditional things we've built. So here we are in the election every day, hopefully evolving from that caterpillar through the uncertainty of the chrysalis to the gorgeous beauty of the monarch butterfly and the world that we want for all of us, the world that works for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. And as Ada Colau, the mayor of Barcelona, said, in the story of humanity, everything is impossible until it becomes possible. We're called upon to do the impossible now. Fortunately, that's what humans have done again and again and again. And I'll close with this quote from the science fiction writer, Adrienne Maree Brown, who said, all organizing is science fiction. And it's intrinsically spiritual, remarkable thing to say, because we have faith that we can build a world that we have never experienced. So with that, I'll stop here. I thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Gil. Amazing presentation. I'm very inspired, and I think many of our participants as well. All right, so there is the first question from Ivan Begunov. I'm going to read questions, and maybe some people will also raise their hands to ask questions, and Christine will transfer. How do you think, who can be the core global player who may sufficiently force or encourage sustainable technology adoption? At the moment, it looks like corporations are trying to match popular trends, but are not willing to do something that radically reduces profits. National governments often have oil-dependent budgets, and some of them are influenced by corporate lobbyists. What kind of stakeholder can actually have enough influence and resources to push sustainable agenda when it interferes with national or corporate interests on the permanent basis?
Let me, it's a great question. It's a fundamental question, and let me answer it in two different ways. First, who has leverage? Everybody, as I've tried to say. There, all of us as voters, where voting is effective at driving political change. It is in some places more than in others. All of us as people who buy things, who make market demands on companies. Legislators in parliaments and city councils and so forth, pardon me, but also the corporations themselves. The questioner asked, will companies do this if it takes away their profits? And I would say, probably not unless compelled to do so. But as I've said, as I've learned in my 30-year experience working with some of the best companies in the world, this is a path to more profits, not less profits. This is a path to more resilience, not less, to more ability to navigate the future, not less. One of our clients, by applying everything from the natural step framework to systems mapping to circular economy analysis, we found for them, this is a $6 billion revenue company, we found for them another $6 billion a year of value. That was not our measure, that was their measure based on the work that we did. So the old notion that sustainability and profit are at war with each other is just flat out not true. Now, politically, there's a politics of companies as well as a politics of politics. There are industries in the world that will not do well. There are industries in the world that will suffer, and there are industries in the world that will die. Sheikh Zaki Yamani, who was the foreign minister of OPEC in the early 1970s, said the fossil fuel age is going to end. It's not going to end because we run out of oil, any more than the Stone Age ended because we ran out of rocks. It's going to end for a different kind of reason. And we saw an example of that in California some years ago. Our political system allows for referendums. Citizens can gather petitions and put a policy measure on the ballot without having to go through the legislature. 1 year, several oil companies from Texas organized to put a measure on the ballot. And the measure was to dismantle California's world-leading climate strategy. We have been, since 1971, California has been on a path to a renewable carbon-free economy. This initiative would have defeated that. What happened was remarkable. In almost every other policy battle, the alliance would be the business community on one side and the environmental community on the other side. The environmental community would say, let's do this thing. And the business community would say, no, that's going to cost us profits. Let's not do this thing. And of course, who had more money to put into the advertising on the campaign. In this case, the alliance was different. On one side were the oil companies. And on the other side were the environmental organizations and the civic organizations and the technology companies and the healthcare companies and a whole host of business. The business coalition split. And the fossil fuel industry was by itself on the losing side. They spent dozens of times more money than our side spent, and they lost. So that says to me, and Tony Seba's work says to me, and the rise of renewables in the world says to me, and the ban on fossil fuel powered automobiles says to me that the fossil fuel industry is in its death phase. Will it happen in 5 or 10 years? Probably not. Will it happen within 30 to 50 years? Absolutely. All right, I just said don't make predictions, I just made one. So if you're in the fossil fuel industry, what do? What's your future? Do you move into renewable energy? Do you move into carbon sequestration? Do you spend your money to continue to convince your government to try to protect you even though you're dying? If you're a country who depends on foreign exchange from sale of fossil fuels, what do? Because that will happen. So back to your question, I think companies will increasingly get on board with this transition. What they will do, how fast they will do it, is it adequate? Don't know. That's where it's up to us to push them as consumers, customers, and as citizens. Thank you for the question. Pavel, got another one?
Yes, I actually have 2 questions of my own. So one is connected to the talk I have been giving last week, beginning of this week, when I was talking about cultural shifts happening in our society across the globe. I was speaking about regenerative economy, and my statement was that the shift to regenerative economies can be partially motivated economically, but it's a big cultural shift. And I had to address it exactly in the spirit of your quote that you still have on the screen, that we need to have faith and we need to mobilize it, so to say. What do you think are those cultural drivers that we can rely upon, so to say, that are engaging enough people in this transition that it truly becomes a cultural movement?
I don't think we could rely on anything, Pavel. I think we have to make the future that we want. It's not going to just be handed to us, right? But where I draw some comfort from, I guess most fundamentally is from the young people of the world. You know, from Greta Thunberg and the people of her generation who are saying, yeah, you can argue about all the details that you want, but we don't buy this. This is not okay. We will not accept this. We will not live in this world. We will push another one. But at the same time, you know, there's people of my generation, some of whom are entrenched in the existing systems and will fight with all their strength to protect it. Some of us, like those of us who have come through the rise of the environmental and sustainable development movement, the work with Buckminster Fuller and others, work with the Natural Zep, who see and have been building this future. We're not stopping, we're not retiring. We do face a very interesting challenge, and I've been living with this year. I see that things that I've been working on, my colleagues have been working on for 30 years, that were dismissed as absolutely crazy 30 years ago. People said, you know, what are you thinking? What are you smoking? We say in California. How can you possibly expect that to be practical? All those crazy things are now on the table in every boardroom on the planet, in every cabinet room, in every parliamentary body, in every city council. These questions are now on the table. Questions that were dismissed 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, are now there. It raises a question for you and me and those of us who've been in this game a long time about what's our role now? What is the best use of us now? It's no longer to introduce these ideas. The ideas are on the table. Maybe our role is to dive into the bowels of the organization, into the guts of the organizations, and do the hard, grinding, day-to-day work of implementing these in policy and practice. That's what I was doing in Palo Alto for 5 years. Maybe it's to return to our role as the scout, the man or woman who goes over the next hill and comes back to the tribe and says, you won't believe what I just saw over the hill. It's amazing. There's something amazing over the hill, or there's something dangerous over the hill. And what happens to scouts? People say, oh, no, you're crazy. You know what you're talking about. Maybe our role is to look at what's next after what we know is next. But there's nothing to rely on other than our own commitment and faith and courage.
Thank you. Another question which actually bridges us to a number of topics that were highlighted in previous lectures, because this is not, let's say, the first lecture that you're giving. This is last in the series, and we had, let's say, two types of voices, I would say. Of course, they're more diverse, but one is advocates of sustainability voices who would strongly agree with your statement about belonging to Earth. And then another voice of futurists and technology scholars that say, well, this is all, if not irrelevant, it's not as a priority as, so to say, technological shifts we're experiencing. And for example, general artificial intelligence bears much more significant risks in the foreseeable future, let's say next 10 to 20 years, than climate change, which is maybe like a subject of 50 years. And maybe we will, if we have general artificial intelligence, we will figure out. So I'm just trying to kind of, because you are sort of ending this series, I want to hear what do you think about, if we juxtapose your position, which I personally would strongly agree with the position of, I wouldn't call them techno-optimists, but people who embrace the idea that it's maybe not as relevant as the challenges of technosphere.
Pavel, we have no shortage of challenges. That's why, I said at the top of the call, there's this stack of challenges that we're facing. My colleague, Chauncey Bell, whenever people talk about problems, he says, no, don't talk about problems. Problems imply solutions. Let's talk about messes. We're in a mess. A mess is a tangle. It's undifferentiated. It's got many different parts. They're all interconnected. I don't separate the challenges of climate from hunger, from poverty, from general AI, from democracy, from life in the oceans, from the challenge of a meaningful life in a world where employment may not be the same thing that it ever was before. So this is a mess that we need to face as the entirety of the mess. Yeah, you need to make some rankings in terms of where you spend your personal time, but fortunately, we don't all need to be doing the same thing. If you're focused more on climate and Chris is focused more on AI and Alina is focused more on poverty, great. Let's do what we are each called to do. The great Buddhist scholar Robert Thurman, I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher the quote here, but he said, how did he say this? He said, the world doesn't need you to do any particular thing. The world needs you to come alive, because the world needs people who are alive. Alive to your passions, alive to the things that you care about, and to be in action on that. Be informed by the larger story. Orient yourself to the multiple messes. Don't look at your own issue in isolation, because each affects the other. Be aware, and then pick the place that your heart calls you to go. Courage and heart. In English, I don't know how it is in Russian. In English, it was from the same etymological root. So, orient, follow your heart, act with courage, and be in relationship to the people who are playing on those other issues. AI, AI is a very mixed and very unpredictable bag. It may be a source of enormous innovation and creativity. It may be a source of human disaster. There are very strong and articulate voices on both sides of that story. We don't know. So for me, in the face of we don't know, I'm not going to drop my concerns to think that something's going to fix it. There's some magic God descending from the heavens in the form of an AI that will fix it. I have to ask, what can I do now that contributes the best I can right now, and be open to changing and evolving as I learn more as the future unfolds. I hope that's a provocative answer.
Very, very interesting. Just a moment. Коллеги, есть ли у кого-то еще вопросы сейчас? Мне кажется, что как раз для нашей работы в понедельник с темами по энергопереходу было бы важно, возможно, прояснить что-то. Я просто не хочу монополизировать. У меня, конечно, еще есть вопросы, я просто не хочу монополизировать пространство. Мгм. Хороший вопрос. Монополизировать. Спасибо большое. Хорошо, тогда давайте, может быть, еще один вопрос тогда от меня. Gil, I think maybe I'll ask the last one, and if someone surfaces and will ask their question, I will let it also happen. And otherwise, we will move to the group work and analysis of your statements. So, in terms of a change driver, do we understand correctly that you're envisaging a movement building process as the key driver? Because I also know that you work with, let's say, the topic of change of financial incentives and the topic of remodeling our financial systems and reorganizing, let's say, systems of exchange. And perhaps financial system is, in some regards, is at the core of the problems we are facing in terms of why the world is not sustainable. Movement building seems to be important, but the system redesign seems to be like inevitable if we really want to shift in the direction of a truly sustainable and regenerative economy.
Yes, yes. Well, your question includes another question, Pavel, which is what is the relationship between movements and system redesign? Right. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's a matter of movement, but many movements. There's the movement of the Greta and the high school students staying out from school every Friday and sitting down in front of the city hall. That's a kind of movement. There's the movement of investment managers and asset managers working for decades to bring environmental and social and governance concerns into the financial system. Initially by a bunch of hippies who became investment advisors and were dismissed as crazy and then built powerful, profitable companies and now represent, depending on who you talk to, somewhere between 25% and 35% of the financial assets under management in the United States today are in some sort of ESG, environmental social governance, filtering. So from hippies on the fringe 30 years ago to 1/4 of the assets under management, it's pretty interesting. That's another kind of movement. We see that growing even more now. We did a report in association with the UN Secretary General's office last year called Force for Good. Capital as a force for good. You can find it at forcegood.org. And this, we interviewed and benchmarked 60 of the largest asset managers in the world. Pavel, you know where this work came out of. We met at that conference that gave rise to this work. And benchmarked 60 of the largest asset managers in the world around the SDGs and chronicled enormous amount of activity, commitment of capital resources, shifting of investment filters. Interesting side effect of the report is that companies who thought they were doing very well and were leading the world now can compare themselves with their competitors and say, oh, we're maybe not doing as much as we should be doing. So it's another kind of movement, of competitive movement between companies to have them raise the bar higher and higher and perform better and better. That said, is it good enough? Absolutely not. Are all these companies, all these financial companies honoring their commitments? No. They're making commitments to renewable energy, but many of them are still investing heavily in coal, even though coal, as of today, is not a profitable investment. So it raises the question about if you're going after profits, why are you doing that? None of the countries that have committed to the Paris Climate Agreement are on target with their commitments. Very few of the companies that have made these declarations of carbon neutral are on target, are on pace with their commitments. So it comes back around to movements of customers, voters, and companies making decisions. We see companies now who are telling their suppliers, their supply chain, we will not do business with you unless you meet our standards of environmental, social, and governance commitments. So that's not political, it's not legislative, it's economic, driven through the private sector. So there's movements at every level. It will take, we all know, look, we all know this. Has anybody here ever tried to change a habit? You know, yeah, everybody's hands should be up in the air. And we know that it's hard, but we also know it can be done. You know, whether it's to lose weight or stop smoking or whatever it is. Has anybody ever tried to change your wife or your husband's habits? Yeah. So you know how hard that is, and that can be done. Can you change the habits of 10 or 100 or 100,000 people in an organization or the habits of a country? Well, that can be done. In my country, in the 1980s, two mothers, both of whom had lost young children to drunk drivers who hit their children and killed them, took it upon themselves to change the story in the United States. The story when I was growing up was, yeah, you can drive when you've been drinking. It's a matter of macho, you're strong, you can hold your liquor, it's cool. That was the story when I was a teenager. And they said that story is over. And they mounted a national campaign to delegitimize drinking and driving, not by the laws. The laws were already there, but they created a social movement that made it socially unacceptable, not a source of pride, a source of shame. Does the problem still exist? Yes. Are the social norms utterly different? Yes. We see that around smoking. Same thing, they're still smoking, but the social norms have changed. So there is a process of change that happens in large institutions as well as in our personal lives. What it says to me is that we can't just sit back and expect to change to happen. It's not simple. It's not easy. All of our inertia is to stay the way that we are. But hopefully we grow and learn and transform at individual level, company level, societal level.
I can see Vladimir raises a hand, and there is one more question in the chat, and I think that will be it because we're approaching our ending time. So, Vladimir, please go ahead.
Да, спасибо за прекрасную, интересную лекцию. Вопрос такого характера. Как мне кажется, вы очень хорошо показали определенный тренд и его неизбежность. Вы показали те сообщества, представленные очень разнородно, которые могут быть драйверами, инструментами внедрения этого тренда. Но у меня вот такой вот вопрос. Как вы считаете, насколько этот эволюционный процесс может быть стабилен? Я поясню. То есть ведь индивиды, которые являются членами сообщества, как вы сказали, как клиенты и как члены электората влияют на данную повестку, ведь они являются в какой-то степени заложниками качества продукта и уровня интереса их к этому продукту. Если появляется суперпродукт, ну я позволю себе гипертрофированный пример, например, там эликсир вечной жизни, который требует уничтожать ресурсы. Не считаете ли вы, что появление таких продуктов сможет остановить эволюцию данной повестки и отбросить нас назад? Спасибо.
It's a good question, Vladimir. Thank you. I hope I didn't say that these changes are inevitable, because they're not. Life is contingent, and we don't know what the future will bring, and it could go well, it could go badly. Some of that is the result of what we do. Some of that is factors out of our control. So that's why I'm emphasizing that our commitment to the things that we care about, our commitment to the change in the direction that we want to go is indispensable part of that evolution moving forward. That said, I would not say, I'm intrigued that you think about people as prisoners of products. Because to some degree, I have a choice of which products to buy. Now it's limited by what's offered on the shelf, what's available in the marketplace. But I have a choice to buy the thing in the blue box or the thing in the yellow box. I also have the choice to not buy it at all. So there's two games happening there together. One is that as a customer, I'm voting with my rubles. I'm accepting or not accepting the choices. The other is that as an entrepreneur, I'm saying, you know, I think the blue box and the yellow box are garbage. I'm going to make something in an orange box that works better than both of them. And I'm going to capture the market and go to you who thinks you're a prisoner of the blue box. I'm saying blue box, it could be car, it could be food, could be, you know, type of house. I'm going to give you a better choice. And this is the story of the world behind me of Silicon Valley, is disruptive innovation, making products that didn't exist before and were unimagined before. I mean, do you remember life before Twitter and Facebook? It's barely 10 years ago. We lived quite fine without that. We lived without electric cars, and they were a luxury, maybe silly item. We lived in a world powered by wood energy. We lived in a world powered by whale oil. People innovated, created something that was better, that was more compelling, and broke that prison, whether by technological innovation or by human will and commitment to something different and something better.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't get to rest. We get to work.
Thank you, Gil. Last question, and I'm sorry, like we basically are sorry, Chris. Maybe one last thing. So a question from Dmitry Khrapov, who asks: you are inviting us to reinvent the economy, but is this future economy? Do you see it will be like a battle between the capitalist model and a model that embraces sustainable development, or is it a reinvention of capitalism? What do you think will happen in terms of how radical is the reinvention that is required?
I'm smiling because it's a hell of a question for the end when we have some more time. We should have another call specifically about that.
Maybe you say 10 out of 10.
Let me just say a couple of things by closing. It's not a battle between capitalism and sustainable development. We see in the world now, we see capitalism and various versions of socialism, ranging from, you know, the Scandinavian model to the China model. But all of them live in a world of economism. All of them are captured by the thesis of economics. That has never done a very good job of engaging with the living world, at dealing with the values of living systems. Everything gets rendered into money, what my friend Chauncey Bell, who I mentioned before, calls the financialization of everything. And that's more the battle. And that's a battle for the United States and Russia and Sweden and China and Germany, with however different our systems are. Is how do we reconcile those? And this, it's a great place to close, because back in my work with Buckminster Fuller nearly 50 years ago, it was clear to me after that exercise, diving deep into the planetary situation and how to build a world that works, it was very clear to me that one of the most fundamental problems was what I called getting the prices right. Getting the prices of things right. Because we're living in a world where the prices that we pay for toothpaste and gasoline and everything in between, the prices don't reflect the real costs of those things. The prices doesn't carry the environmental costs, the health costs. Gasoline, for example, we have health costs from pollution, we have climate impacts, we have for the United States, enormous military costs in protecting the sea lanes to bring fossil fuel to the United States. It's one of the reasons that this country has moved so hard in the direction of fracking to reduce oil imports. Amory Lovins, the energy guru from Rocky Mountain Institute, estimated some years ago that the gasoline that we pay $2 or $3 or $4 a gallon for at the pump actually costs $15 to $20 in real costs to society. So a question I ask is that if I had to pay $20 a gallon for gasoline instead of $4, would I own the car that I own today? Absolutely not. That would be an incentive to me to get a different way to, either a different car to own or a different way to get around than that. If it were $20 a gallon, would anybody be manufacturing the cars that they're manufacturing today? Nope. So part of the game is to remove the subsidies, both the explicit subsidies that governments pay to companies, but also the implicit subsidies of the things we allow companies to do and not bear their responsible costs for. So yes, I think that is one of the issues. For me, that's a focus point. For me, reinventing everything on the planet has to include reinventing the financial systems. And that's where I'm increasingly focused in my current work these days.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gil. It's an amazing conversation. I really appreciate your time and your presentation, and look forward to actually explore how this could be done in our reality.